Hey there! Today's podcast focuses on Star Wars, Indiana Jones, the Muppets, the Dark Crystal, Disney attractions, and so much more from the work of George Lucas and Jim Henson with author Brian J. Jones. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 66 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. As always, I am your host, Dan Heaton. Now, I focus a lot in this podcast on theme parks and often discuss Walt Disney and what made him such a unique individual and how his creations were unlike things we'd seen before. And I think that description can also apply to George Lucas and Jim Henson. Both men were forward thinkers that were able to show a lot of skeptics that they knew what they were doing. Jim Henson in the field of puppetry with the Muppets, with what his production company did beyond that through the Dark Crystal and Labyrinth, and their contributions to so many other film and TV projects. George Lucas obviously is known for Star Wars, but his work on ILM and with digital filmmaking makes him a lot more than just the man who did Star Wars or Indiana Jones. I thought I knew these guys, but I barely knew anything about either one of them. After reading the biographies of Henson and Lucas by Brian J. Jones, which are long reads, but also flow really well, I feel like I have a better gauge on what they've done and just really enjoyed the experience of getting to know more about what they do. And Brian also wrote biographies of Washington Irving, a person I know almost nothing about, and Theodor Geisel, Dr. Seuss, is his next book coming out very soon. So it was a blast to talk to Brian and get to know a lot more about these guys and also have some fun talking about Star Wars. Before I get to that conversation, I did want to remind you that the Tomorrow Society podcast is a listener-funded show. There's no advertisements, we don't have a sponsor, and this is a passion project for me to do. But I always appreciate any support that you're willing to give to help make this show possible. And that's why I've set up where you can become an official member of the Tomorrow Society on Patreon by pledging $1 or $2 per episode to help support the show and keep it going, where I can talk to just really cool people like Brian and so many others. And you can learn more by going to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. That's patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. So this was a fun one. I loved getting to talk about Star Wars and the prequels and everything that's going on in the head of George Lucas, if any of us can really understand that. So let's go to my conversation. Here is Brian J. Jones. All right. Well, my guest today is the author of comprehensive biographies of Washington Irving and Jim Henson and George Lucas, and his latest biography about Theodor Geisel, a.k.a. Dr. Seuss, will be released in May. It is Brian J. Jones. Brian, thank you so much for doing the podcast.
Hey, Dan. I am so glad to be here. You and I have been trying to connect for a while, so I'm glad we made this happen.
Definitely. You know, I think that With guys like Jim Henson and George Lucas, there's a lot of connections to Disney especially, but to theme parks. But before we get into all those books, I'd love to learn more about how you got started. I know you worked like in public policy and a speechwriter, but what made you decide, okay, you want to write biographies?
Well, as I found out years later when I started doing biography, I didn't realize that working in politics was actually pretty good prep work for biography, because your job in politics is your member will come to you and will say, someone's going to introduce a bill that does this. Let me know whether you think I should co-sponsor it. Find out, and get back to me. So you go out and you get copies of the bill. You talk to people who are for it. You talk to people who are against it. You call people outside of the building and say, what do you guys think of this? You go to the Library of Congress and get information. You get background information on the issue. Boil it all down, compress it down to 2 pages if you can. Brevity was always my problem, as anyone who reads my books might agree. And then send it into your boss and give him your opinion and ask him his. And that was actually really good prep work for biography, because that's kind of what biography is. It's taking a lot of disparate sources and information and archival matter and interviews and distilling all that down and finding your narrative and giving your opinion and doing it in a compelling way. I got into biography, kind of relatively late. I mean, I'd been working in politics for almost 30 years, probably 20, 25 at that point. Washington Irving is one of these subjects I got really interested in him because I'm a huge fan of Christmas. And Irving is kind of the father of our Americans' version of Christmas is actually Washington Irving's version. We all think there's some old school Victorian Christmas, and there's not. Irving made it all up. But I had never heard of that, so I did some research into Irving and wanted to learn more about him, and there wasn't a biography, so I decided, well, I would love to write one. It was a 7-year project, and just I kind of got it, hit it at the right time. It was before the market dropped out of everything. But that was my first book, and that was how I got into biography. I was writing a book about someone I was really interested in that hadn't been done in 80 years at that point, and that was sort of the beginning of all this. And after Irving came out, I wanted to do another and found out nothing had been done on Jim Henson, and started having conversations with the Henson family. And 5 years later, the Jim Henson book came out.
Well, that's interesting, because I'll admit, even you mentioned that story about Christmas, which now I need to read your book to find out about, because I haven't read the Washington Irving book. But I'll admit, I'm not really an expert on Washington Irving. I mean, I know The Legend of Sleepy Hollow as much from like the Tim Burton film or the Disney cartoon. And so why do you think that is, that Irving, who was at the time really a big name, why is it not carried over as much beyond kind of those connections?
Yeah, it's Irving's such a cool topic, and it actually was a good sort of, first topic for me to do, because he really was the pop culture of his time in the same way my other subjects have all been. Irving, when I was pitching that book, I was telling everybody he was sort of the best I could even come up with it was the Sinatra of the 19th century, because he was one of these guys, like, if he needed, if he was renovating his house and he needed money, he would write a book. And, it's like anything he wrote was going to sell. And he was our first best-selling American writer. He was born right after the American Revolution stopped and right before the Civil War started. So he occupied that kind of weird, very early period in American history. But what I always say about Irving is his bust kind of fell off the mantelpiece. He was one of these guys that was, our most highest regarded writer. And his 2 big stories are kind of in the American DNA. Like you talked about Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And I always tell people, like, tell me the story of Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And they'll say, well, I haven't read it. And I'll say, that's okay. Tell me the story. And everybody can tell you the story of the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. And telling it in 2 sentences is actually getting it all. I mean, there's not a lot. Irving's mostly about mood, but everybody knows that story. Rip Van Winkle, even if you don't know the story, you can even say he's the guy I think like fell asleep for 20 years. Well, exactly. That's the story of Rip Van Winkle. So these pieces of Irving kind of got into our American DNA, and he wrote so much stuff in his lifetime. Not all of it's great. A lot of it's really long. But I think what happened with him is after he came along, and he really did it, he nurtured people like, believe it or not, Edgar Allan Poe and James Fenimore Cooper and Nathaniel Hawthorne. It was kind of like, jump starting early American literature. And then along come people like Mark Twain, and they've got this very different, modern, strong American voice, which Irving kind of has. Irving's surprising because you expect him to be Nathaniel Hawthorne, like this very puritanical, very Puritan prose. And Irving's not. He's like John Byrne doing comic books. He's like breaking the fourth wall. He's talking to the readers and doing all these little asides. So he gets kind of a bum rap when you lump him in with early 19th century. But you had all these new voices that came along, and I think kind of just washed him out as that came along. He was viewed at that point as very quaint. So he's the name we sort of like put the check mark next to him. We kind of know who he is, and we acknowledge he's there, and we don't really read him or care that much about him.
Part of it is probably when the fact that he was, pre-Civil War, he's not connected to the kind of legends of George Washington and Paul Revere and all that. He's kind of in that weird zone that even when you think about what you're taught in history as a kid, it's like, okay, Revolutionary War, Louisiana Purchase, War of 1812. Okay, now we go to the Civil War. I know there's more to it, but you don't really learn that much about that time.
Yeah, that's sort of that weird early period. And before we move on, one of the things I love about Irving, because again, when it comes to pop culture, I mean, the guy is like Forrest Gump of his time. If there was somebody famous, he knew them. If there was some huge earth-shattering event going on, somehow he's in the middle of it. Irving essentially invented what we now call viral marketing. Like, he wrote his very first book, and to promote it, he placed all these fake ads in the New York newspapers, like a missing persons ad. And people were like, what is going on? Who is this missing person? And he would say, well, there's a book that was left in the guy's room, and we're going to publish the book, and maybe we'll know about him. He was, he was really, really brilliant, really ahead of his time. Was appointed ambassador to Spain by John Tyler, and he hung out with Daniel Webster, and he danced at the White House with Dolly Madison. And, Edgar Allan Poe was begging him for blurbs to his face and then stabbing him in the back once he got him. And just like really just great story. Dickens admired him and came to visit him and stayed with his house up in New York with Irving and his brother Ebenezer before Christmas Carol comes out. So, Irving's got his hands at a lot of really different, interesting things at the time.
It's going to be hard for me to focus now. I'm going to just go read this book, but I think there's a documentary, right, that you're involved with that's going to come out next year about Irving, right? That probably people with all these stories, I expect people are going to be just stunned by some of the stories.
Yeah, a good friend of mine named Billy Tuma is doing, he does these really interesting documentaries that are almost like animated in a way. They're really clever. And it'll probably be out mostly on YouTube to do. That tends to be what he does. He does them and he puts them out for everyone to see. And they're really interesting. He did one on Washington's farewell address recently, and he's a really interesting, smart guy. So it should be a lot of fun.
Well, great. Well, let's move on to Jim Henson, which I know I realized pretty quickly when I read this book last year is that I thought I knew a lot about Jim Henson, and obviously I know the Muppets. I grew up with, I was a kid and I remember seeing the Great Muppet Caper and the Muppet movie and everything, but there's so much more to it than that. So what really excited you up front and got you interested in doing this?
Well, one of the things I love about Jim is Jim was always able to find innovative solutions to problems by using things that I always said were hidden in plain sight. For example, one of the things that's really cool about Jim is, people our age and younger who grew up on the Muppets and Sesame Street and, the Electric Company and kid shows like that, we're used to seeing the way puppets look on TV. To us, the puppets have always moved around on the TV screen. And so when Jim was growing up, a puppet show on TV was a puppet theater. It was Kukla, Fran, and Ollie with the puppet theater, film the puppet theater with the curtain in front of it and someone poking the puppet out. And Jim was the first one to say, hey, the camera of the TV is the puppet theater. I don't have to build four walls. The edges of the TV are the four walls. All I have to do is use all that space. Which, when you think about it, seems so incredibly obvious, but it was a huge innovation. And that's the way puppetry looks on TV now, to all of us, especially who grew up with it. But Jim was the one that figured out that very elegant solution to that, hidden in plain sight. And then the next thing he does is he decides, well, if what's on screen is what really matters, I need to know what that looks like. The simple solution is he put a video monitor in front of him to watch, which is still the way Muppet performers work today. If you watch film footage of the Muppet performers on Sesame Street or anything performing, they're never watching the puppets over their head. They're always watching the monitor on the floor. Again, makes perfect sense. You know exactly what the camera is seeing, but that's something that nobody really came up with till Jim came along. So one of the things I loved about Jim was sort of what a gadget nerd he was. Like, he always had these really great ideas and was always kind of hoping the technology was going to be there to do it. Sometimes when it wasn't, something like the Dark Crystal, he would research it and he would do a little bit of tech transfer, for example, with Lucasfilm to get the technology to build something like Yoda first, who's sort of a dry run, and then take that technology and move it into the Dark Crystal. Other times the technology wasn't there and wouldn't get there in Jim's lifetime. He at one point in the 60s envisioned this sort of modern club called Cyclia, where you would have, music videos broadcast on the wall and in time with the music, and the lights would pulse in time with the music, and the floors would be translucent and video would shine on that. The technology didn't exist for that, and that's basically every dance club that ever existed since about 1978 now. But, Jim abandoned that project in like 1972 because the stuff just wasn't there. Something like CGI technology, he dabbled with it, but it hadn't quite even caught up with him when he died in 1990. He had basically he had CGI technology at his beck and call, and he sort of blows his wad in the opening credits of the Jim Henson Hour. Like his entire budget goes into the opening credits of that to use CGI there. So Jim always loved the technology and could always, find interesting things to do. And people would always ask me, what would Jim be doing today? Which is a dangerous question. And I think the best answer I can ever give is, we don't know. I can't answer that because Jim could take something like the current smartphone technology or something and think of something we haven't thought of to do it. And it might be something, again, completely obvious solution hidden in plain sight that we just hadn't thought of using the technology that way before. So that's one of the things that made Jim really exciting, was just how his brain was constantly going, and how once he got onto one project and succeeded on it, he was ready to move on to the next. Walks away from the Muppet Show at the height of its powers. 5 years in, he could have kept doing it. He says, that's a very nice show. Nice is a very Jim Henson word. And walks away from it. Does the same thing with Fraggle Rock. I mean, just like completely creatively restless his entire career.
That's so interesting, because that question of what would they do now, I feel like it's asked of a lot of whether it's a musician or like Walt Disney or someone, there's always that question. And it's like, so much of the innovation came from what they did, even George Lucas too. So it's like, I mean, he's still alive, but what they're doing now, it's so hard to know. But you mentioned the Dark Crystal, which it showed up recently on Amazon Prime. And so I watched with my daughters, and I had totally forgotten, because I watched that as a kid. I remember seeing it in the theater at like age 6 or 8 and being just freaked out by the whole thing. But I was surprised by how inventive it was watching it now. Also how dark it was, but just reading it in your book about the background and what they did, and really thinking through like, oh my gosh, how are puppeteers maneuvering everything that's going on here? And I know it was so personal to him. So why was that such a big thing for him to do at the time?
Well, it's interesting. Dark Crystal is very representative of Jim's sort of artistic bent. The Muppets, are the very colorful side of him, but something like the Dark Crystal or Labyrinth, that's Jim's art. That's the way he loves to invent these worlds. And you even see it in 1975 when he does The Land of Gorch for Saturday Night Live. I mean, that right there is kind of a dry run even for Dark Crystal. It's already got kind of that look to it. It's like when he was having the puppets built, he told his puppet makers, give me mossy, like nothing very specific. He said, give me mossy. And so, that's very much his artistic sensibility on screen there. And Jim loved building the worlds. He loved knowing the backstory. And, if you needed a chair in the world of Dark Crystal, you wouldn't just go to a prop closet and take out a chair. He would think about what kind of tree grows in this world. And if you cut it across the grain, what would that look like? I mean, very, very detailed. Jim loved world building, almost to the detriment, some would argue, of the story. But Jim loved building that world. And what's really fantastic about the Dark Crystal, and again, it occupies, sort of like we talked about Irving in this weird place in American history, Dark Crystal occupies this very weird, specific time in filmmaking where, had he done it a couple of years later, they might have started CGIing and things. But everything in Dark Crystal is built. There's not a single visual effect in there, I think, except for a sky at one point. Everything you see actually exists, which is really, really amazing. And what everybody told me is that what was so fantastic about those sets, and you see these sets and they're gigantic. They said you would walk around the back side of it and the set was still finished. It's like the guys at Pixar always talk about how they paint the bottom of the drawers in their animation. Those sets for the Dark Crystal, you would walk around behind it, and it was still completely finished. It was you could have walked the camera all the way around the set, and you would never have seen 2x4s. The entire thing existed, which is just astounding.
I think you can kind of sense it, because that's the thing. The two things that really struck me watching that were the world building, which in kids' movies now, and I'm generalizing, there are exceptions, you don't see, I mean, the thing really, the first, like, so many minutes takes its time, and like, here are the Skeksis, and here's everything, and here's the world, and here's the crystal, and it's like, movies move so much faster now. I mean, it moves slow. And two, just like you said, the scope of it, where I think in a weird way, your brain kind of senses when things are fully built, even when they don't need to be. It's like there's something about it physically that your brain kind of treats differently in some way. And similar to Labyrinth, even though both of them, I mean, Dark Crystal, I think, made more money, were not big successes. So it's almost like now I feel like they're appreciated a lot more than they were when they came out.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I always say about both those movies is Jim was right about both of them, just at the wrong time. And in fact, Labyrinth came out when I was in college. And I think I was a freshman in college, and I actually went to see it on a date, and we kind of walked out of it going, what in the hell was that? Because again, it occupies this weird place. Is it funny? Is it serious? Is it music video? Is it, it was, nowadays we wouldn't even think about it because it's doing so many different things and we don't try to lock things into one specific niche. But nowadays, when I talk about Jim and I put Labyrinth up on the slide in the room, the place goes bananas. Like, people love Labyrinth. I put up people love Dark Crystal. I think Jim would love that those movies found their audience. It just, once again, like with Jim with technology, it took everyone a while to kind of catch up with him on that. And the one of the really interesting things about Dark Crystal, and a couple months ago, I think people were issuing the footage goes around and around. You see it come up again about every year. People find it again. But when Jim was envisioning the Dark Crystal, sort of talking about that world building, he wanted to do the movie, as Lisa Henson put it, almost like an opera, in that no one was going to speak English. The Skeksis, they had developed their own Skeksis language, and they had languages for the Gelflings. And there's actually raw footage, which you'll see pop up on the web every once in a while, of the Skeksis at dinner. And they're having this, horrible conversation and screaming at each other and yelling. And it was all in a language that had been developed. And they showed the rough footage, and, Michael Frith tells the story about walking downstairs, and, Jim's like, "What did you think?" And Michael Frith says, "Jim, I don't know what the hell that was." And Jim's putting the sofa cushions on his ears saying, "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it." But, Mike Frith says, he knew he was going to have to change it. Nobody was going to want to sit there and listen to people hooting and hollering and squawking at each other for 2 hours. So it was just this hugely ambitious project, which I think today maybe he could have gotten away with. At the time, I told Lisa Henson this. I said, I was part of your problem. I was 13 when Dark Crystal came out, and I walked out of Dark Crystal going, "Well, what happened?" And poor Jim, when you read the transcripts of him doing interviews at the time, every interview, the guy wants to promote his brand new, beautiful, artistic film he's poured his guts into. And the first question he gets every time, "Where are the Muppets?"
It's too bad, yeah, because Dark Crystal, it's not, I mean, now it's circling back. I mean, there's supposed to be a new series, which is so interesting that it's happening now. But it does seem like, I mean, because he did such a good job with the Muppets, I mean, it's impressive that he was able to accomplish so many other things that have lasted and wasn't completely pigeonholed. And that's a testament to how artistic and how experimental he was, that he found ways to fund all these things and do it the way he wanted to do it, regardless of how successful they were at the box office.
Right. Well, and I think maybe this can segue us into one of your big topics. Is I think that's one of the reasons he wanted to sell his company to Disney, is because he had seen movies like The Dark Crystal, but moreover, Labyrinth had not done great at the box office. And I think even more than Labyrinth tanking, I think the fact that when he had tried to do the Jim Henson Hour on TV and the Muppets didn't land for the first time, I think that really spooked him. And I think that was the point that Jim said, I can't be Mr. Businessman. I need someone else worrying about the chasing overhead was the word I kept hearing a lot. Jim had to chase the overhead. He was worrying about running the company. And Jim just wanted to go out and create. And so the one thing that made selling the company to Disney really attractive is that he got out of chasing the overhead. He could just go. He was going to probably cut his own deal to have his own production company where he could do whatever he wanted. Didn't have to be the Muppets. People would say it could have been Labyrinth 2 and Dark Crystal 2 and 3. Whatever he wanted to do, they probably would have locked him up into a 15-year exclusive. But, it was a really attractive deal to him because he had seen how Disney had taken care of Mrs. Travers and the Mary Poppins stuff and A.A. Milne and Winnie the Pooh. He knew this is a place you could sort of park your icons and that Disney would take good care of them. Now, whether that's been borne out, we can have that discussion later. But at the time, this seemed like the place to put the Muppets and let Disney take care of the bookkeeping and be the suits, and Jim could go be the creative type. And a lot of people told me they thought he might even have been willing to walk away after 10 years and just say, let somebody else play with the Muppets. I'm going to go do something else. So, the Disney deal to Jim was really important because it was going to let him do a lot of different things. But one of the things it was going to let him do was play in a corner of the park. They were going to give him his very own sort of corner of, Disney Hollywood Studios now to kind of do whatever he wanted. And that's the one section of the book that a lot of people come up to me and are just shaking their head saying, wow, what a huge missed opportunity, missed because Jim died. But when you start seeing some of the really fun ideas for rides and restaurants and things that he wanted to put into the parks.
That makes me sad. And it's selfish because I think, wow, that would have been great to see. But I mean, I'm glad that he was able to at least get started on, Muppet Vision 3D, which is still there, and makes me nervous that we'll see if it, if it lasts forever, because
I'm nervous.
Know. Yeah. With Star Wars Galaxy's Edge going right next to it, it's a little dangerous.
Up the real estate out there, yeah.
But the thing that excites me still to hear is, the idea of his idea for this like massive, great movie ride parody with Muppets and all the things he wanted to do there. So can you talk a little bit about some of his ideas and what might have happened if he had lived longer?
Sure. Well, first of all, what's really interesting about even the stuff that does exist like Muppet 3D is you have to remember Jim didn't have a deal. He was essentially doing the work on Muppet 3D because he thought he was going to have a deal. So Jim was almost working pro bono, not literally, but didn't have his deal yet. But he was so excited about the idea of coming into the Disney parks that he was developing things without actually having a deal in place. And the one thing that he finished that remains is Muppet 3D, which is just beautiful. And again, shows you what Jim was doing with the technology at the time. That's when the 3D/4D movies were starting to come out, and just how much fun Jim was having with them. But Jim loved the dark rides and really wanted to do the great Muppet movie ride that made fun of all the traditions in the movies. And as Jim said, it would be all about the history of movie making, and all the info would be wrong. And he envisioned it as having cars that were, almost like cable cars that were kind of strung through the ride and hanging and dipping and swooping. And another one that, was a lot of the tricks he had learned. He wanted to do a lot of animatronics, a lot of the tricks he had learned from Dark Crystal. And again, he's doing them with Disney, who know how to do the animatronics. So Jim was really in heaven coming up with a lot of these ideas, because one of the things he loved is the Disney Imagineers never told him no. That something couldn't be done. There was a great story. He's walking through the park with Mike Frith, and there was one place where there was a facade stamp. He said, God, it would really be great if we could, if there was a tree there, we could remove some of the wires. And the engineer said, where do you want them? I mean, it wasn't, that can't be done or that's impossible. They said, where do you need it? When do you want it? And so Jim really loved that nobody told him no. But he had ideas for themed restaurants, and Disney's played around with some of those even as recently as last year with Rizzo the Rat's Pizzeria. Right. And, so Disney tried to grab some of those, but I think kind of lost their heart in it. But Jim had a lot of really fun ideas that never even got off the page. Mike Frith, who is a beautiful artist, worked oddly enough for Dr. Seuss, draws, just these beautiful, hilarious, sketches of Fozzie as the Frankenstein monster and things like just really great stuff that would have been really, really fun. And I don't know how big his section of the park would have been. I mean, I imagine they would have probably taken that entire corner where Muppet 3D is.
Yeah, it's alternate universe or alternate history, because Disney MGM Studios, now Disney Hollywood Studios, it kind of, for a while, Disney wasn't sure what to do with it. And It was like sort of a studio, and then they couldn't get the production. So then they were trying to bring in, they started with Indiana Jones and with eventually Star Tours and all of that. But to think about if they had made, Muppet Vision 3D to me is pretty much the best of all those 4Ds that were made around that, even better than Captain EO and some of the other ones. But if they had made that audio animatronic extravaganza, and if they had used, like you said, his animatronic stuff, it could have changed the entire direction of that entire park into a different way. Yeah,
and I don't know how much a dirty word this is now, but I think they wanted Jim to be the John Lasseter of that park, like the way they gave Lasseter California Adventure and said, like, just rebuild this in your image. I really think they wanted Jim to do a lot of that in Disney MGM, because I think you're right. I don't think they had any real idea what to do with it. So let Jim Henson kind of take it over. Again, it's a really sad missed opportunity that never happened.
Yeah, because now, I mean, now it's basically the park of, I mean, I'm sure they're going to do great job with Star Wars
Oh God, yes.
and with everything. And they're going to add in, a new Mickey ride, and they're going to add more things. And like I said, I hope that Muppet Vision survives. And the themed restaurant, yeah, they have the Pizza Rizzo restaurant.
Can't we make it the Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem rock and roller coaster? Why does it have to be Aerosmith?
They got to do something there. Yeah, I mean, that would be great. And there's just so many opportunities. And I think, though, and I know I want to transition to George Lucas soon, but I want to talk about, we had the Muppets and kind of where we think they're going, because that relates to that attraction and kind of where it goes, because, they had that sitcom, the Muppets that came on, that was kind of a weird mix of like more for adults. And I found it kind of fascinating when I watched it, but I knew it didn't feel like it was going to work. And now they're talking about having another Muppet series for Disney Plus, their streaming service. Are the Muppets still able to, are we going to see a resurgence, or is it one of those things that they're just going to keep trying and not really hit?
Oh gosh, I'm wiping my eyes frantically on this because I wish I knew, and there are times I wish I had a lot of hope. I don't know. Acquiring the Muppets was great idea, bad execution so far. And I think, well, I'll get to this in a minute, but I think partly what happened is I think other people like Marvel and Lucasfilm learned their lesson from watching Disney kind of botch their deal with the Muppets back in the day, and even now, where it's like, when you come in and get the company, you keep the creatives, which Disney wasn't going to do that with them, and with the Muppets, and I think it really doesn't know what to do with them right now. And partly when the Muppets tanked, they were trying to figure out what had gone wrong, and I think the problem with the Muppets, the thing you have to remember about them is they're always, it sounds very trite, but they're always family. So they always come back together at the end of the day. It's really hard to inject sort of modern day angst and tension among the Muppets, which is what the Muppets was trying to do. Character is king with them more than plot. And so I think that was kind of what they were struggling with. I think they were getting there when they canceled the show, and like, I mean, Pepe, the Prawn, is just a brilliant character and was really coming around into his own, and they were starting to kind of feel their way with the characters and bringing in people you hadn't seen in a long time, Uncle Deadly, like these really great old characters, but the show wasn't really given the time it needed to find its way. And when you think about it, the Muppet Show in the original in 1976, it didn't set the world on fire right away either, but 1976 was a very different time. They would give you 26 episodes to find your way in a season. And they didn't really have that luxury now. I think they might have gotten it had they given them maybe one more season to go. But I don't know. It's hard to tell. And there's times right now that it's hard to tell if there's a hand on the wheel of the Muppets.
Yeah, and I say this as someone, I mean, there was the first Muppets like reboot movie was very successful, was very well done, had that family feel, and really fit. So it's like, I talk about it like, well, way back, it's like they, Jason Segel and the group that created that, especially the first, new film, seemed to have a handle on it, and it was very successful. So it's not like it was 20 years ago when they were successful. It's fairly recent.
Right. And I think, what I've been hearing about the relaunch on the Disney streaming channel, it's, again, I don't know how much it's substantiated, but I'm reading that it's Josh Gad, who knows a thing or two about musicals and things like that. If they can go back and sort of, if they want to make it nostalgic and try to make it a variety show, parody again and do it back, I think that's something that people would watch. I mean, and you might be able to say, oh, but it's so contrived. It's the same old formula. Guess what? Same old formulas are working on TV all the time now. We're rebooting everything. So I think you could pull it off again with the right people. You just need to feel like there's somebody there who's not going to drive the car into the ditch. And I haven't heard that name yet. But Josh Gad, I would have some confidence in if that was the direction they were going.
Yeah, I mean, you can look no further than The Force Awakens to show as an example of where doing something similar to what's done previously, and I mean this with all due respect, I thought it was very well done, can be very successful.
Right. I agree. Yeah. I agree. I'm a Force Awakens fan. I agree. There's times you don't mess with what works, especially when you are rebooting, or you take something like the new Star Trek reboot, where you kind of, you brought in the original Spock to sort of hand that baton off and acknowledge what went before. You could do something like that very clever with a new Muppet series. If you just need to feel like there's a hand on the till. So we'll see what happens.
That's so important with any franchise that gets this big. I think you're seeing it with the success of Marvel and mostly with Star Wars is that if you have that direction and have the right people, you can do a lot. So speaking of that, let's talk about George Lucas. So I know that, I mean, it seemed like, at least from reading the Jim Henson book, that you were able to speak to a lot of people that knew him and were able to, I know there's a lot of other research, but I know George Lucas is generally considered a pretty private person and wants to control things. So was it more of a challenge as you were preparing to do this to really do a biography of someone like George Lucas?
Yes. It's odd. It was easier and harder. Partly, first of all, it was frustrating that I wasn't going to get him. So I thought I was for a little bit. I made a run at him. And I had actually emailed back and forth with his assistant, and we got along okay. And then I finally got a no. And a lot of people, when I told them that, said, "My God, you got a no?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I got to know." They said, "No, you don't understand. He never says anything to anyone. The fact that you even got to know was a big deal." So, so I think he knew I was out there. But the biggest problem I had is he NDAs everybody. Everybody who ever worked with him has a non-disclosure agreement. Like, nobody can talk. I had a lot of people who I reached out to, and they're like, "Well, if you can, unscrew my NDA, more power to you, and I'll be happy to talk." But it just wasn't going to happen. But what I found out as I got into this is, first of all, he talks way more than he thinks he does, and has been talking constantly since about 1967. So what actually it turned out to be was there was more information out there than I ever dreamed was going to be. And there were times I despaired of ever finishing it because it was just this gigantic pile to get your arms around. So I think, and what I hope happened with that book and what it looks like happened is what I set out to do, which was, when we think of George Lucas, we tend to think of him in silos. He's the Star Wars guy, or he's the Indiana Jones guy, or he's, the ILM guy. But when you start telling the story chronologically, when you start putting everything together and saying, this was going to, you start realizing how many balls this guy had in the air at any given time. One project's in development while another one's being filmed, and he's finishing up another one. He'd have 3 movies going. And then the other thing you have to admire the hell out of with the guy is if you told him no, you would basically say F you, and he would go out and build it. Special effects, I'm sorry, there's no special effects shops. Okay, F you, I'll go build my special effects company. I need digital equipment to make movies. That doesn't exist. Okay, fine, I'll hire some people inside my company to make it. I mean, just builds everything he needs to do it, all in the name of control. Anyway, that's getting beyond the scope of your question. But the answer to that is it turned into this gigantic project that I couldn't have envisioned because there's just so much stuff out there. Star Wars is its own cottage industry, as is Indiana Jones. But Lucas talks all the time. I initially thought I wasn't going to have anything from him, and it turned out there was so much stuff to go through that, as I said, I almost thought I'm never going to be able to finish this.
Well, yeah, and it's easy for me to forget too, like, reading the book, and it's kind of like, okay, there's Star Wars and Indiana Jones, and then obviously some of his early work. It's like, oh yeah, American Graffiti, and oh yeah, they did a sequel to that, and there's so many other areas that he did, and like you mentioned, all the work on the effects and the innovations with ILM and everything. It's one of those things where you write a book that, I mean, the book is quite extensive, but it's one of those where you get done and you're like, there's even more to it. It's like, how are you able to condense all that into, especially with Star Wars? Because I feel like there's been whole books written on the creation of Star Wars and whatnot. How are you able to kind of find what your story was for him for some of those big projects?
Well, the story that drives Lucas, and again, this was the through line on everything, which is why the very first chapter of that book, which is a prologue, is called Out of Control. And it's all about filming Star Wars in the desert when the remote control R2-D2s aren't working and the sand is pulverizing everything and ruining his lenses. And Lucas has lost complete control of this film that he's convinced is going to fail. So the pieces I tried to focus on throughout Lucas's entire story and when he was working on Star Wars is what was he doing to keep control of everything? And so, the name of the game in Star Wars was controlling the money. It was controlling the special effects, you in there and writing on John Dykstra's back at one point and just saying, I need a shot a day now. You've frittered away everything while I've been filming, the actors. I need a shot a day now. You have a year to go. I need a shot a day until this is finished, and just writing over him. So every step of the way, he was trying to control his own film because for him, the filmmaker was key. He didn't want the suits involved. He didn't like producers mucking around telling him, he had to cut a scene because there wasn't any money. That really pissed him off whenever he had to go on bended knee to say, I need $40,000 more to finish this movie. And they would say, no, George, you can't have that. And he ended up squeezing 20 grand, I think, out of him to finally finish the cantina scene and was never happy with it. So the line I tried to follow the whole time is first of all, what's pissing him off? What's out of his control? And what's he doing to try to get it back? Whether it's, controlling the, every aspect of the script. We always forget, Lucas talks about what a terrible writer he is. And, you can argue whether he's, the king of wooden dialogue, as he calls himself. But the guy was told by Francis Ford Coppola. Coppola's the one who said, you have to learn to write original scripts or no one's ever going to take you seriously. Meanwhile, Coppola built his career adapting other people's work, like The Godfather and The Outsiders and all that. Lucas is the one who's creating one iconic character after another. Again, controlling the narrative, controlling the story, controlling the characters, controlling every aspect of his film and of his filmmaking. So that was a line I tried to follow all through the process. The bonus was, while I was doing that, I got to be writing about Star Wars.
Yeah, that doesn't sound so bad to be able to do that. But the control, you're right. I mean, that's the through line through the book. I mean, you mentioned, I like the story of them cutting like 4 minutes out of American Graffiti and him being like, okay, Universal, you're dead to me forever, basically.
Yep. Yeah, and when Universal comes back later and tries to bid on Raiders of the Lost Ark, he's like, nope, you don't even get a seat at the table. I mean, he is still mad, 20 years later about that.
And he made so much money off that movie. And it was such a big hit. But to him, it wasn't exactly what he wanted. And then I have to ask you, too, about the flip side of the control, because I feel like in a lot of ways, his success, if he hadn't been that way, Star Wars might not have ever existed. He needed to be that way. However, then he keeps going back and doing all the tinkering and the no and the, all the, I mean, some of this, the effects look great, but it's like, it's weird to me. I mean, from your perspective, it's all connected, right? Like his inability to give those up is because they weren't exactly what he wanted, right? He doesn't, fans criticism, trying to think of a better way to put it.
You're exactly right. You're tiptoeing around it, but you're exactly right, because Lucas invented digital filmmaking because it was the closest he was ever going to get to getting everything on the screen exactly the way he wanted, which is why when he finally gets there with the Phantom Menace, there is more stuff on screen than you can ever hope to digest. I mean, there's like stuff going by a billion, because that's him just sort of like, holding out for 15, 20 years and then just exploding on the screen with all the stuff he's been wanting to do. Then what happens is you get a little undisciplined when you can do everything. So, but there's a saying in probably, writing as well, but in biography, we always talk about how books are never finished as much as they're abandoned. And I think Lucas with Star Wars always felt he had to abandon those movies because the technology wasn't there for him. He couldn't do it exactly how he wanted. So he can never leave it alone. So we keep getting one new version after another of the ultimate Return of the Jedi, all these different versions of the movie that have all these new touch-ups. He just can't let it go. It's never enough. It's never going to be perfect to him. No matter how much the technology allows him to tinker around with it and do it, he's never going to get it in the condition he wants. So I just don't think he will ever let it go.
Yeah, and there's other examples of directors. I mean, Michael Mann is a director who's been successful, who constantly is putting out director's cuts, but they're not doing Star Wars. And I think the fact that it's or Ridley Scott with Blade Runner, there's just this, I think Star Wars, it's just so personal to everyone, and rightfully so, to me too. I grew up quoting every line from the first Star Wars when we had this VHS copy that we wore out. But I think you bring up a really good point with the prequels, especially to me, Attack of the Clones, where I feel like there are moments where like they get taken in by these aliens and then they're running through this completely fake like set with all this stuff. And I'm like watching it. I remember seeing it in the theater going like, this is too much.
I'm overwhelmed.
I barely remember the movie. It's like too much, but it works out. Like I remember seeing the trailer. I'm not going to get too far into just ranting about Star Wars for a while, but the trailer for Phantom Menace, which I remember seeing, and I was not a person that went to the movie theater just to see it, and I remember thinking that this is going to be the greatest movie of all time, because what he was doing there fit so well in like a 3-minute trailer.
Yep.
But not so good in a 2-hour movie. I'm glad he came back and did it, but he just couldn't do it all together the way he wanted.
It's funny. So I follow the debate with, what do we call the new 3? Are they the sequel trilogy. What do we call the 8, 9?
I don't even know. I don't know. I guess they call it the like
Skywalker saga. Okay.
Yeah, or something, but it's like 7, 8, 9. No one really has I haven't heard a good way to call it yet.
Yeah, the sequel trilogy. I don't know. Anyway, it's interesting because, first of all, I'm 50 and I went to see him and I'm tired. And I watched him and I loved him. But I hear people saying, well, it's not my Luke Skywalker, or they're unhappy with the way it's going. And what I always tell people is, let me back into it. I get asked a lot when I talk about George Lucas, what do you think of the prequels? And my response to that is, they weren't for me. I have my Star Wars. I was 10 when Star Wars came out. I was the target audience.
Right.
I was 10, 13, 15 for Star Wars, Empire, and Jedi. I was the target audience almost every time. I have my Star Wars. I'm good. It's like John Lennon, when people talk about the Beatles getting back together, he'd be like, what do you want that for? You got the records. I have my Star Wars. But what's interesting is the prequels, my daughter's 23. That was her Star Wars. But when the prequels came out, we all bitched about them and how, the conversations you and I were just kind of having, they're overdone, there's too much. The thing that gets me the most wound up is I don't like Anakin Skywalker building 3PO. That one bothers me almost more than anything else. But it's like, the people who are in their 20s now, they love them. Those were their Star Wars. So I think the current 7, 8, 9, as much as we all want to debate them, and those of us who, came up with the original Star Wars, like, well, it's not quite the way we did, people in 20 years, that'll be their Star Wars. I think there's always going to be, and the way Disney's talking, I think there's going to be a Star Wars for every generation at this point. Distance makes things look more glorious. And it's kind of happened with the prequel trilogy. The prequel, people go back now after, what I loved is after Last Jedi came out, people were like, oh my God, they should have let George Lucas do it. Look at episode 1. All of a sudden the prequels were the greatest Star Wars ever done because Lucas had complete control over them. So, the more things change.
Yeah, it's so interesting because, I saw Return of the Jedi. I remember seeing in the theater when I was 7. I think I may have seen Empire when I was really young. I think my daughters now are almost 10 and almost 6. And I took my daughter to see Last Jedi, and they've seen the earlier ones. But to them, I think I look back and I saw Solo with her and such. Like, these are the movies she is seeing in the movie theater, and saw Force Awakens, and I don't know if they're going to have the same impact, just because for me as a kid seeing Star Wars, now so many movies have come after that are not the same, but that built on that blockbuster culture and everything. There's so many other ones, but it's still interesting to think about it because I really enjoyed The Last Jedi, but for some reason I feel like I'm not as emotionally invested in it as some who look at it and say, this isn't, like you said, that's not my Luke Skywalker. I look at it and I'm like, wow, that's a really interesting thing they did with Luke Skywalker. Somehow it's different because being older, I have the investment, but not in that way.
No, I absolutely hear you. There's times I'm like, it's a Gen X thing or something. But so it's like, when for people my age, when Yoda shows up on screen the first time, that's the moment I tear up.
Yeah.
Because there's my Star Wars showing up in it. That's the moment I'm welling up. But when they're having discussions about, the Force belongs to everybody, I'm like, that's beautiful. But I'm like you, but I didn't walk out of there. It's like I walked out of some of the prequels pissed.
Yeah.
But so I walked out going, that was lovely. Not perfect, but that was lovely. And I think that's what happens with distance and age on some of these. But.
Yeah, it's never going to connect with you. It's similar to music, where the music I listened to when I was 21 or 18 is going to connect with me more. Just like the bands I listen to now is a lot of the same as one I listened to when I was 22. It's it's not going to connect the same way. But I don't want to take too long without talking about the theme parks too, because George Lucas did have some connection with Star Wars to that. And it does relate to his control, I feel like, with Captain EO especially, because that movie is one of the odder things, and I guess most expensive per minute at the time. And it's funny to forget that Francis Ford Coppola directed that, which still is one of the strangest things to me. So, from your research and learning about that, how did those two and Michael Jackson work together at all?
Well, let's start by backing up just a little bit and talk about Lucas with Disney parks to begin with, because you have to remember, little George Lucas was at Disneyland on opening day in 1955. So Lucas has been a fan of the Disney parks his entire life. I think finally having the opportunity to design rides and attractions for Disney was the culmination of, his life when he finally got to do that. This is a guy who'd been, going to the park. When he was a little kid, he and one of his other friends put together a little, a little newspaper they would sell to their friends. And George's columns were essentially reviews of the Disney rides of his recent trip to Disneyland. So Disneyland is very near and dear to George Lucas. So having said that, now you finally get to the point where they put him in the park. And what also was very interesting about this is somebody being asked to develop an attraction for Disney who does not make films for Disney, who doesn't deal with any Disney characters. It's like this weird anomaly in the parks when it happens. You know, I remember first visiting Star Tours, and it was odd. Here's Star Wars cropping up in the real world in a Disney park, and Disney doesn't have anything to do with Star Wars, at least at the time. That speaks to how influential Lucas was, and also how much he wanted to make something like that happen. When Disney can get George Lucas to agree to do an attraction in their park, you know, that's a coup for them. And again, remember, Lucas isn't doing any Disney characters. So it's a huge deal for both Lucas just as a creator and for Disney as a company to be able to get a hold of that. So when he starts doing Captain EO, part of it, again, is Lucas doing sort of the Jim Henson thing, going in there and playing around with this technology, this brand new technology, and how they're going to get it to work. And Lucas, this is at the point in his career where he's done directing. He doesn't need to direct anymore. So he wants to sort of executive produce Captain EO, and he wants to oversee everything, which means boss everyone around in Lucas's book. But he doesn't want to direct it, so he brings in his dear friend and mentor, who he has now clearly outshone, Francis Ford Coppola, to direct. So like you said, it's odd. You have Coppola, who's doing The Godfather, Godfather 2, and Captain EO right in there. Anyway, a very odd pairing, but then you've got, you know, arguably the biggest pop star in the world at that point, not arguably, the biggest pop star in the world at that point, Michael Jackson in it. I mean, I think it's one of those things that George Lucas, whoever he wants, he's going to get. And the initial idea for this story was pitched as, I think the first title was something like The Intergalactic Music Man, which is just a god-awful title. But, you know, that was the name of the game. And it still sort of shows up a little bit in that Michael comes in and brings the power of music in and reforms everybody, which is kind of the plot of The Music Man. But, you know, it was just whatever George Lucas wants, George Lucas gets. And I think partly, too, I don't know this for a fact, but I believe Michael Jackson had been asking Disney if he could do something, because he's a huge Disney fan as well. You know, sort of the perfect storm at that time to get that team together. And the person that absolutely steals the show actually is probably Angelica Houston.
Yes.
I think so.
Well, you look at it now too with her, and I'm used to seeing her more in recent films, and I'm like, she was so young, and she's, you know, and she's like, I remember as a kid, you know, she's like reaching her fingers out to the screen. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a little much here. But I think you bring up a good point though about the characters, because Michael Eisner became the CEO of Disney they fought off a hostile takeover in the mid 80s, and immediately from things I read, like came in and said, okay, Disneyland's not cool anymore.
Right.
We're doing the same things. We redid our Fantasyland, whatnot, but we need to bring in cool things. And he had his son who was like a 10-year-old, and he was like, what's cool? And it wasn't this simple, but you know, and so then he's like, let's bring in Michael Jackson, and let's bring in Star Wars, and let's do all these things. And now it seems so normal because there's all kinds of things that aren't really Disney or aren't the same way, and the parks are so different with Marvel and whatnot. But then Star Tours was like, it was weird, even though they were doing things at the MGM studios that way, but at Disneyland it was totally strange.
Yeah, again, it was just this complete anomaly out there. It was like a gash opened in the universe, and here was Star Wars you could touch in Disney, which was, again, it was just so odd because Disney was a place where you saw Mickey Mouse. It was almost like when you first saw Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and you've got, you know, Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny on screen at the same time. Yeah. You're like, there's something, you know, it was like the world's colliding. It just was weird. So there was something so odd about Star Wars in the park. And now, of course, we don't think anything of it. It was a huge deal. I mean, I remember waiting in line for hours to get onto Star Tours when it first opened. It was a very, very big deal. That's the best I can do with it. It was gigantic when it happened at the time. It was just everybody wanted to go see it. You know, you were going to come back and report how long you'd stood in line. That was going to be part of the experience. Standing in line is always a very big part of the George Lucas / Star Wars experience.
Well, people should prepare for the.
Oh my God! Oh my gosh! This Galaxy's Edge is just going to be huge. I guess I'm going to have to go get in line now. I'm going to write by 2021.
I know. I'm looking at it going like, I want to see it, and especially Disneyland, because that park's so small, is going to be just crazy. I mean, they have like 5-hour waits when they added Johnny Depp to Pirates, and it was like a 4-hour wait. Or when they redid Star Tours with the newer, different variations, they had crazy
I haven't got to
waits.
do that yet. Darn it!
Oh, it's a lot of fun. So that's gonna be interesting. But I want to ask one more question before I ask you about your new book. I wanted to ask about the purchase of Lucasfilm from Disney, because obviously we've already talked about kind of what they've done with the films and such. So from what you observed, I mean, what really made, obviously we see the connections to Disney and why that was really the only place you would sell to. But what was it that Lucas finally decided he was ready to, mostly pretty much step away?
This is my opinion only on this. I believe that it was going to take a lot to pry the car keys out of his hands. And I think what finally happened with him, because remember, George Lucas is all about control. So I think what finally happened with him is initially the narrative, sort of like with Jim Henson, the narrative was always like Labyrinth failed so badly he wanted to sell to Disney. And that's not true. With Jim, it was when Jim Henson Hour tanked. With George, the common narrative tends to be, well, after the fan backlash from the prequels, he was so pissed he took his toys and went home and sold to Disney. I don't think that's true either. I think what was the final straw for him was Red Tails. And when he did Red Tails, and again, remember, Lucas envisioned this as a trilogy. Lucas loves to think in trilogies with, 3 different parts. And typically he was like, let's do the middle part first. So and this was a film he'd been wanting to make since like 1990. I mean, it was a really important story to him, the Tuskegee Airmen. He really believed in it strongly. It was, really close to home for him, for somebody who's, a progressive politically and from out in, Modesto, California. It was like a story he really wanted to tell. It was very close to him. And this is even before he married, this is 18 years before he married Melody Hobson even. So it was a really important issue to him. And when he finally made that film, he ended up paying for everything on it. It was really critical to him to have a African-American writer, African-American director, be as genuine as he could. And again, that's another one like Jim with Labyrinth. He was in the right place at the wrong time. That movie tanked. And then 2 years later, the screenwriter for that wins the Oscar for 10 Years a Slave. So Lucas's heart is in the right place on this. The movie comes out. He's trying to find a distributor for it. Nobody wants to pick it up. I think that's the moment when Lucas has had it with Hollywood. He's on The Daily Show after this movie is just bombed, and he comes right out and says Hollywood is racist. I mean, just comes right out and says it. So I really think that the Red Tails experience left such a bad taste in his mouth that was the moment he threw up his hands and said, I'm done. And that was when he started the conversations with Kathleen Kennedy about taking over the company and then moving it over to Disney at that point. So I think it was his frustration and really just disgust with the system, which again, remember, Lucas's disgust with the system has been driving him since like 1968. But I really think that what he considered the blatant racism of the system really, really annoyed him at that point and left a terrible taste in his mouth that he was finished.
That's a good point about 12 Years a Slave and about even the wrong time, basically, because they dumped Red Tails. I mean, I think it came out in January or something. It was gone from theaters so fast. It was given no chance.
Yeah, and it's a really it's a really important subject. Unfortunately, the film is not great, and the effects don't look finished half the time. But part of it is because I think Lucas was just out of gas when they were making it. And again, he's bankrolling, he's doing everything on that, and the scenes were showing obviously. But he was just when he did a showing in Hollywood to try to get somebody to distribute it, and half the studios didn't even send people. You read the interviews with him; he is pissed at Hollywood. So that's the moment I think that he throws, takes everything off the table and just says, I'm done. Goes to Kathleen Kennedy, brings her in. And almost before she's, got the chair warm, he also says, I'm also going to sell the company to Disney. So
yeah. And she's like, this is not what I expected to happen. And it's interesting too, because it sold for like $4 billion or so. And I think at first people are like, wow, that's a lot of money. Is that a risk? And then very, very quickly it seemed to be, Disney's probably going to do okay here.
Yeah, it turned out to be a fantastic deal for them. I think I know I'm in the minority with a lot of people. I think they've managed the franchise beautifully.
I agree, because I feel like they were able to get a lot of the original cast involved. There's nothing really, some would disagree. To me, there's nothing embarrassing about they didn't bring back the original cast and then have them doing just the most ridiculous things. You can see a through line where Han Solo feels like Han Solo and, all of that. So I think they did a good job. I think Solo has spooked them a bit with what happened there with their hopes. It'll be interesting to see what they do with the next film and what going forward.
Yeah, I'm kind of psyched about The Mandalorian, to be quite honest. At first I was skeptical of that, but I'm kind of excited about that now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's like with their new streaming service and everything, they have so many options that, I mean, what they could do is this is things that weren't possible 15 years ago.
Exactly.
All right. Well, before we finish, I want to make sure to talk about your new book, Becoming Dr. Seuss, because it's coming out very soon. So what interested you, after doing books about these two, monumental artists, to then move on to another monumental author and write about him?
Well, first of all, I'm determined to own everyone's childhood, so I got to just keep finding out who the most appropriate icons are. I love writing about creative people, about the creative process. I was the kid that watched every making of and behind the scenes feature on DVDs and any behind the scene documentaries. Like, I love the fly on the wall stuff. I love to know how people do. I love to know the process. Dr. Seuss is one of those people that when I started him, I was not a Seuss kid per se. I didn't learn how to read with Dr. Seuss. I learned how to read with comic books, which would probably appall him the more I got into it. But I learned how to read with comic books, and Dr. Seuss is what I kind of read at the dentist office. So I didn't have that with me with Dr. Seuss. But the more I got into him, the reason I ended up calling that book Becoming Dr. Seuss is I was so fascinated by how his life kind of occurs in these three major arcs that, we kind of look at him now that he emerged fully formed, and he was always Dr. Seuss and always sort of the kindly old bearded man who wrote the books for children. And his entire career is not like that. He had this very successful career before he was 40, where he was Don Draper, essentially. Like, he had this very successful career as an ad man, creating these iconic advertising campaigns that he was drawing for. But, that was his first career. He was drawing cartoons for magazines, but had this big career as an ad man, and gets into children's books not because he feels compelled to tell stories for children or because he thinks children are a good audience and children need books for themselves, but because he's locked up in an exclusive deal with Standard Oil to do their insecticide commercials. But the one thing that he can do, so he's prohibited from doing a lot of stuff, but the one thing he can do is children's books. So he starts writing. He writes And to Think That I Saw It on Mulberry Street, because essentially there's money left on the table. He's permitted under his contract to do children's books. So starts writing children's books, again, because the money was on the table. Writes two or three or four books, and then World War II breaks out. And this is sort of the next arc of his career. He goes into the Army, and he learns about storyboarding from Frank Capra. He's in the Signal Corps, and he's making the Private Snafu cartoons. And so he learns a little bit more about concise storytelling. So the next arc of his career is starting to tell stories a little bit better and develop these characters. And that's where Horton Hears a Who comes out of. And, really writing stories that start to have messages for kids. And then the final arc of his career is all about books for kids that have a pedagogy behind them. He gets into word lists. He writes Cat in the Hat on a bet, essentially. Like, they have approved lists of vocabulary words for young readers, usually about 300 words. And somebody comes to him and says, can you write a book that first graders can't put down? The only catch is you have to just stick with these words on this word list. And it takes him like 2 years to write The Cat in the Hat, because he's just hamstrung by this word list, and puts that book out, and it is just a blockbuster. And that's 1957. I mean, he's almost 50 years old. That's finally the point in his career when he can start writing books full time, because up until then he hasn't really had a blockbuster. So it's just, it's a really fascinating career trajectory, and how he's sort of learning the craft. And by the time he gets to Cat in the Hat and that book takes off, and oddly enough, in the same year, The Grinch comes out. He has two huge books come out in the same year. Then he sort of takes on writing books with these controlled vocabularies for kids, and launches an imprint called Beginner Books that have these controlled vocabularies for kids to teach kids how to read. And he becomes very committed to reading and taking reading seriously, and taking writing for children seriously. And he talks about how, one page in a kid's book is the equivalent of a whole chapter in a novel. So, he's taking the craft very seriously. And that's what I really came to admire about him, was how seriously he took this job writing for kids. He said they were the toughest audience to write for, because they could see right through any tricks that you might try to throw in to fool a grown-up reader.
I didn't really read that much Dr. Seuss as a kid, but my daughters, especially when they were a bit younger, read a lot of Dr. Seuss. I've read a lot to them. And there is a certain style of, like, the way that the words go, where sometimes they're kind of hard to read, actually, the way the words kind of like as an adult, but there's just a certain way that the words flow into each other. And you mentioned how long Cat in the Hat took to write. There's just a sense that someone has really spent some time figuring out not just the story or whatever, but how these words kind of flow together in kind of a weird way. But I'll admit, I don't know much about him at all. Like you just mentioned things that I knew nothing about. And I feel like with Washington Irving in this, I'm proving that I'm a very limited education or limited background about people. But I think it's good because a lot of people, I think, don't know much about Theodor Geisel beyond that he wrote these books. So I'm really excited to find out more. Beyond what you just said, what really surprised you about him kind of as a person when you really dug into him?
Partly is, he's sort of like Lucas in a way in that he does not suffer fools gladly. When after Cat in the Hat comes out and he's permitted to start his own imprint at Random House called Beginner Books. So he's the president and editor-in-chief of this new imprint that's going to start putting out books for children, about 4 a year or 5 a year, using this restricted vocabulary list. And so under that imprint, you get books like Go Dog Go, like a lot of books you've heard of that he doesn't necessarily write, but he was editing. Berenstain Bears. Berenstain Bears were a perfect example of this. They were like one of his star clients underneath this imprint. But he would call you into his office and he would have all the pages of your book stuck up on the wall. And he would start going through everything that was wrong with them and, what was terrible, what rhymes didn't work and how this page didn't work because the lines have to look the same length. The way they look on the page is as important as the way they sound. And, and these people would walk out of there going, what in the world? But, was so serious about it. And if he couldn't get what he wanted out of it, he was probably not going to publish your book. He would probably, if you see a lot of these books that are credited to the pseudonym Theo Lessig, that's Ted Geisel spelled backwards, essentially. What that usually tells you is that somebody gave him a manuscript, didn't like, and they couldn't fix. So he finally took on himself to just fix it and then put it out under a different name. So if you see these Theo Lessig books under the Beginner Book imprint, it's probably one that he, sort of Frankensteined together.
That's interesting. It's funny because Go Dog Go is one, just talking about what you mentioned, where I thought it was his and only learned fairly recently. It's like, oh, no, wait, he's not even the author of that. But the fact that he's involved, because it does feel kind of similar. And it's interesting that this through line, like you mentioned, of Henson and Lucas and now Geisel, of all the people that seem to want, Henson seemed to be a little nicer about it, but wanted so much control and ownership. And I guess that's a through line with each of your books.
Well, and the other thing the three of these guys did is when it came to something like merchandising, in his lifetime, you think about that, there's really no Dr. Seuss merchandise. Most of that happened well after his death because he was sort of the same. He's like, I don't want to spend my life policing the stuff. Let's just not do it. Because you had companies saying, we could make you $1 million putting this out. And he'd say, I don't want to do it because I want to make sure it's okay. And I don't have time to sit and make sure it's okay. And Jim did the same thing. Jim Henson wanted everything that they were making delivered to his office. And he would play with it himself and make sure the characters looked right. And he would veto things and not let them. And Lucas did the same thing. Lucas was like, I want toys and I want to see what they look like. And I want to play with them all. And they better look right. And, when you have people, again, controlling every step of the process. But people somebody told me how frustrated toy companies were because they'd say, Geisel was essentially leaving $4 million on the table because he'd just say, I'm not going to do that. You want to make stuffed animals? I'm not going to let you do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting because with all of them, you've had cases where, there's still quality control, but it's not always the same. Now you have, with Dr. Seuss, you have what's really cool. You have the Dr. Seuss land at Universal Orlando. I don't know if you've ever seen that, but again, it's different. It's not exactly what he did. It's kind of close. And who knows if that would have been something unlikely. It sounds like that he would have even liked that. Well,
and it's hard to tell with something like this new Grinch movie that came out. It's like takes place in the Grinch, the Dr. Seuss universe, and it's giving him new backstory. It's sort of the sort of the Dark Knight version of the Grinch, where you give him a backstory. It's like let Christopher Nolan do the Grinch, and people are like, well, what would he think? And I don't know. I'm guessing he might not like that because I think his view would be like, look, the book's the book. And don't mess around with that. Because that's what happened to him when they were doing the, like the Grinch cartoons and the Lorax cartoons. He went in there and he was like, don't muck with the book. And he would, again, police every step of the process on this. So taking these ideas and springboarding off of them and giving the Grinch backstory, I'm not sure he would have, his widow signed off on that. But I'm not sure he necessarily would have in his lifetime allowed something like that. I think he would have considered that mucking with the source material too much.
Yeah, and I think it's a testament in all the cases to the fact that there's so much long-term resonance is because they were so crazy about it. Well, Brian, This has been great. It's been really cool to talk with you and learn so much about all these books. I can't wait to check out the new book. And so if listeners want to learn more about your books or pick up a copy or follow you, where should they go online?
My website is Brian J. Jones, spell out my middle name. Otherwise, you get Dead Rolling Stones. BrianJJones.com. And you can find links to all my books there. You can find me on Twitter at Brian J. Jones. I'm running my mouth over there a lot. Or you can find me on Facebook at official Brian J. Jones. I think I'm on every platform, but really Instagram at this point. So,
well, awesome. Well, I really like the books, and it's been a lot of fun to talk with you. So thanks so much for doing this.
Well, thank you. And this has just been a lot of fun. And, everybody go out there and go to Galaxy's Edge and report back before I go stand in line.
Report to us now from the line.
That's right. Report to us from the line.
I don't know if we're there yet, but give it a few months. We'll be there. Well, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Well, that was great. It was awesome to talk to Brian and learn some more about George Lucas, Jim Henson, and a lot more. I wanted to apologize for the sound quality at the end. I'm definitely working to keep improving how the show sounds, so hopefully there won't be issues like that in the future. If you like this episode, I'd recommend you check out my conversations with Jeff Baum, Christian Moran, Rand Boyd, and Aaron Wallace, who are all authors that wrote books connected to theme parks and related topics. You can find those episodes and a lot more at tomorrowsociety.com. You can also reach out to me by email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, or follow me on Twitter at tomorrowsoc, or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. Don't forget to check out my page on Patreon to help support the show at patreon.com/tomorrowsociety. You can also support the show through Apple Podcasts by subscribing and leaving a rating or review, which helps more people find out about the show. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I will be talking with Greg Meter, who is a sound designer who worked on the sound for attractions like Phantom Manor in Disneyland Paris, the Jeremy Irons Spaceship Earth, the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror at Walt Disney World, Splash Mountain, and a lot more. You don't want to miss this show. It's going to be great. Thank you so much for listening and for all the great support. And I will talk to you again very soon.